A dying farmer was lighting what he thought would be his final fire when he heard crying in the snow outside his cabin. What he found crawling toward his door would challenge everything he believed about life, death, and the power of love. A baby carrying his dead wife's wedding ring was about to reveal secrets that would either destroy him or give him the miracle he never dared hope for. If you want to discover how one impossible night changed everything for a man who had given up on living, hit that like button, subscribe to our channel, and ring the notification bell for more incredible stories of hope against all odds. Samuel. Garrett could taste death on his lips as he struck the match against the rough wooden beam of his cabin. The flame flared to life, casting dancing shadows across the sparse interior that had been his world for the past 3 months, ever since. Dr. Henderson had delivered the news that tuberculosis was eating through his lungs like fire through dry timber. 6 weeks, maybe 8 if you're lucky, the doctor had said, his weathered face grim with the weight of too many such pronouncements. "I'm sorry, Sam. There's nothing more I can do." That had been 12 weeks ago. Sam had always been stubborn. March wind howled outside his cabin in the Bighorn Mountains of Wyoming Territory, rattling the shutters and sending snow swirling against the frosted windows. At 52, Sam had lived through plenty of Wyoming winters, but this one felt different. Final dot, he fed kindling to the growing flame in his stone fireplace, each movement sending spikes of pain through his chest. The coughing fits had been getting worse lately, leaving bloody handkerchiefs and a metallic taste that no amount of whiskey could wash away. "Well, Martha," he said aloud to the empty cabin, his voice hoarse and weak, "looks like I'll be seeing you soon." Martha's photograph sat on the mantelpiece above the fire, her gentle smile frozen in sepia tones. She'd been gone 2 years now, died bringing their first child into the world, a son who'd followed her within hours, too small and weak to survive the brutal Wyoming winter. Sam had buried them together in the little cemetery behind the cabin, under a cottonwood tree that Martha had loved. Since then, he'd been marking time, going through the motions of living without really being alive. The cattle had been sold off last spring when he could no longer manage them alone. The few neighbors he'd had were miles away, and none had visited since word spread about his condition. Tuberculosis was a death sentence that people feared catching. Just by breathing the same air, Sam settled into his worn leather chair beside the fire, pulling Martha's quilt around his shoulders. It still smelled faintly of her lavender soap, though that might have been his imagination. The cabin fell quiet except for the crackling of burning wood and the wheeze of his labored breathing. He'd written his will weeks ago, leaving the cabin and 40 acres to Martha's sister in Colorado. Not that there was much of value to leave behind, just this small piece of land carved out of the wilderness, a few pieces of furniture, and memories that would die with him. The fire was burning well now, filling the cabin with warmth for what Sam intended to be the last time. He'd gathered enough wood to last through the night and into tomorrow, but after that, After that, he planned to let the cold take him. It seemed like a gentler way to go than the slow suffocation the tuberculosis promised. Sam dozed in his chair, drifting in and out of fevered dreams where Martha called to him from across a great distance. In his dreams, she was young and healthy again, her brown hair catching sunlight as she hung laundry on the line behind their cabin. She was always just out of reach, always calling his name. A sound pierced through his dreams, thin, high, and unmistakably human. A baby's cry. Sam's eyes snapped open, his heart pounding despite his weakened state. The fire had burned low while he slept, casting the cabin in deep shadows. Outside, the storm had intensified, wind shrieking through. The mountain passes like banshees, but there it was again, the unmistakable wail of an infant in distress. "Can't be," Sam muttered, struggling to his feet. He must be hallucinating. The fever had been getting worse lately, making him see and hear things that weren't there. But the crying continued, coming from somewhere outside his front door. Sam grabbed his rifle from above the fireplace, an automatic gesture after decades of frontier living, and made his way to the door. His legs felt like water, barely strong enough to support his wasted frame. The tuberculosis had stolen 40 pounds from his body over the past year, leaving him gaunt and hollow-eyed. He pressed his ear to the thick wooden door, listening intently. The wind made it hard to distinguish sounds, but there, definitely crying. And closer than before. Against every instinct telling him he was too weak for whatever waited outside, Sam lifted the heavy wooden bar that secured his door and pulled. It opened. The storm hit him like a physical blow, driving snow and ice into his face with stinging force. But what he saw in the dim light spilling from his cabin made him forget about the cold, forget about his illness, forget about everything except the impossible scene before him. Baby was crawling through the snow toward his door. The child was barely clothed, just a thin cloth diaper and what looked like a doeskin shirt that provided almost no protection against the brutal cold. But somehow, impossibly, the baby was moving, tiny hands and knees finding purchase in the deep snow as it made its determined way toward the light and warmth of Sam's cabin. Sweet Jesus, Sam breathed, immediately stepping out into the storm. Despite his weakness, the cold bit through his nightshirt and into his bones. But he ignored it as he scooped the child into his arms. The baby was a boy, maybe 18 months old, with the dusky skin and dark hair that suggested Native American heritage. But his eyes were the brightest blue Sam had ever seen, so startling against his dark features that they seemed to glow in the lamplight. The child was frighteningly cold, his lips blue and his small body shaking with hypothermia. But he was alive and looking up at Sam with those impossible blue eyes, as if he'd been expecting him. Sam hurried back inside, kicking the door shut behind him and immediately moving toward the fire. As he settled into his chair with the baby in his arms, he noticed something that made his blood freeze in his veins. Around the child's neck, on a leather cord that looked hand-braided, hung a gold ring. Not just any ring, Martha's wedding ring, the one Sam had placed on her finger when he buried her 2 years ago. With trembling hands, Sam lifted the ring to examine it in the firelight. There was no mistake. Inside the band, barely visible, but definitely there, were the words he'd had engraved for their wedding day: Samuel and Martha forever. Sam's mind reeled. How could this child have Martha's ring? How could he have survived crawling through a blizzard in nothing but rags? And where had he come from? As if in answer to his unspoken questions, Sam heard another sound from outside, a low moan, definitely human and definitely female. Still holding the baby against his chest, Sam grabbed his lantern and ventured back into the storm. 20 feet from his door, partially buried in the snow, lay the body of a young Native American woman. She was beautiful even in death, with long, black hair and delicate features, wearing traditional buckskins that were now soaked through with snow and blood. A crude bandage around her abdomen was stained red, suggesting she'd been wounded before arriving at Sam's cabin. But what captured Sam's attention wasn't the woman's obvious beauty, or even the tragic circumstances of her death. It was her eyes. The same startling blue as the baby's. Now staring sightlessly at the storm-dark sky, Sam knelt beside her despite the snow soaking through his nightclothes. The woman was young, maybe 25, and even through the cold and death, he could see something familiar in her features. Something that nagged at the edge of his memory like a half-remembered dream. In her hands, clutched against her chest even in death, was a folded piece of paper. Sam carefully extracted it, noting how the woman's fingers were positioned as if she'd been protecting it with her last breath. Back inside the cabin, Sam spread the paper on his table while the baby watched him with those unnaturally bright eyes. The paper was old and yellowed, covered in Martha's distinctive handwriting Sam would have recognized anywhere. My dearest Sam, if you are reading this, then little Wolf has found you, and I am gone. I pray that my daughter Blue Sky was able to protect him on the journey, though I fear what it may have cost her. There is so much I should have told you, my love, but I was afraid. Afraid you would think less of me. Afraid you would turn away from the life we were building together. Sam woke to the sound of James crying, a sound that cut through his fever dreams like a knife through silk. Gray dawn light filtered through the cabin windows, revealing that the storm had finally blown itself out during the night, leaving behind a world transformed by snow. The baby was standing in Sam's lap, tiny hands gripping the front of his nightshirt, blue eyes wide with hunger and confusion. Sam's chest ached as he looked at the child, not just from the tuberculosis, but from the sudden, overwhelming responsibility that had literally crawled out of the storm into his life. "All right, little man," Sam said, his voice hoarse from sleep and sickness. "Let's see what we can figure out about taking care of you." The first challenge was immediate. James needed food, and Sam's cabin wasn't exactly equipped for caring for a toddler. He had canned goods, dried meat, and coffee, but nothing suitable for a child barely old enough to walk. Sam carried James to the kitchen area, noting how the boy's eyes tracked everything with sharp intelligence. There was something almost unsettling about how alert he was, how he seemed to be studying Sam's face, as if trying to memorize every detail. "You're Martha's boy, all right," Sam murmured, seeing his late wife's keen intelligence in those blue eyes. She always noticed everything, too. Sam found some oatmeal and cooked it thin with water and a touch of honey, mashing it until it was soft enough for small teeth. James ate eagerly, making happy sounds between spoonfuls that filled the cabin with life in a way Sam had forgotten was possible. While the boy ate, Sam's eyes kept drifting to Martha's letter, which he'd left on the table. Even in daylight, the words seemed impossible. Martha had a son with a Crow warrior. She'd kept this secret for their entire marriage. And now that son was sitting in Sam's kitchen, completely dependent on a dying man who knew nothing about raising children. After breakfast, Sam bundled James in blankets and carried him outside to see about Blue Sky. The woman's body lay where he'd found her, partially covered by fresh snow, but still clearly visible. In daylight, Sam could see that she'd been shot, probably by white settlers or soldiers who viewed any Indian away from the reservation as hostile. The sight of her peaceful face, so young and still beautiful despite death's touch, made Sam's throat tighten. This woman had died protecting Martha's son, had kept her promise to bring the boy to safety even as her own life ebbed away. "We need to do right by her," Sam said to James, who was watching everything with those startling blue eyes. "She died bringing you home." Sam spent the morning digging a grave behind the cabin, near where Martha and their son were buried. The work was exhausting in his weakened condition, and he had to stop frequently to rest and fight off coughing fits that left him gasping and weak. But James sat patiently in the snow nearby, playing with pine cones and pebbles, chattering in a mixture of what sounded like English and Crow as Sam worked. He found himself thinking about Martha's letter, about the life she'd lived before meeting him. He'd always known there were parts of her past she didn't discuss, but he'd assumed it was just the usual reluctance frontier women had about dwelling on harder times. He'd never imagined anything like this. By afternoon, Sam had Blue Sky properly, buried with a simple wooden cross marking her grave. He'd wrapped her in his best blanket and placed her mother's ring, which he'd found in her belongings, in her hands. It seemed like the least he could do for the woman who died, bringing his stepson home. That evening, as Sam prepared another meal for James, he began to notice other things about the boy that struck him as unusual. James was incredibly steady, on his feet for a child who couldn't be much past 18 months. He explored the cabin fearlessly, but with a careful deliberation that suggested he'd learned early to be cautious about his surroundings. More unsettling was the way James sometimes seemed to be listening to things Sam couldn't hear. The boy would stop what he was doing and cock his head, as if someone was calling his name from a great distance. Then he'd look at Sam and smile, as if sharing a secret. "What do you hear, little hawk?" Sam asked during one of these episodes. James pointed toward Martha's photograph and said something in what Sam was beginning to recognize as crow. The word sounded like Emma, but Sam couldn't be sure. That night, Sam set up a makeshift bed for James, using quilts and pillows on the floor near the fire. The boy settled down easily, but Sam found himself lying awake, staring at the ceiling and thinking about the enormous changes one day had brought to his life. He'd been prepared to die, had been looking forward to it, if he was honest. The pain and loneliness had become unbearable, and the prospect of joining Martha and their son in whatever came after death had been the only comfort he'd been able to find out. Now he had a reason to live, but also a terrible problem. How could a dying man raise a child? What would happen to James when the tuberculosis finally claimed him? The boy had already lost 2 mothers. First Martha, then Blue Sky. Sam couldn't bear the thought of abandoning him to become an orphan. Again, Sam's troubled thoughts were interrupted by James crying out in his sleep. The boy was having a nightmare, tossing restlessly and calling out words in Crow that Sam didn't understand. But then, clear as a bell, James called out, "Mama?" In perfect English. Sam got up and knelt beside the makeshift bed, gently shaking the boy awake. James's eyes opened wide, unfocused with fear and confusion. "It's all right," Sam said softly. "You're safe. I'm here." James looked up at him for a long moment, those blue eyes searching Sam's face. Then, to Sam's amazement, the boy reached up and touched Sam's cheek with one small hand. "Papa?" James asked tentatively. The word hit Sam like a physical blow. This child, who had every reason to be afraid of strangers, who had just lost the only mother figure he remembered, was ready to accept Sam as his father. The trust was overwhelming and terrifying. "Yeah," Sam said, his voice rough with emotion. "Yeah, I'm your papa now." James smiled and settled back down, but he kept one small hand pressed against Sam's arm, as if to make sure he wouldn't disappear. Sam stayed there beside the boy's bed until James fell back asleep, then remained a while longer, watching the steady rise and fall of his small chest. In the firelight, he could see both Martha and little Wolf in the child's features. The stubborn chin that was pure Martha, the high cheekbones and proud bearing that spoke of his Crow heritage. The next morning brought new challenges. James was an active toddler, and the cabin suddenly felt both too small and too dangerous for a curious child. There were sharp tools, a hot stove, and a dozen other hazards that Sam had never had to consider before. But James also brought unexpected joy. He laughed when Sam made faces at him over breakfast. He clapped his hands when a blue jay landed on the windowsill. He followed Sam around the cabin like a devoted puppy, chattering constantly in his mixture of languages. "You're going to have to learn more English," Sam told him as they sat by the fire after lunch. "And I reckon I should learn some Crow, since that's where you came from." James seemed to understand more than he could say. When Sam pointed to objects and named them in English, the boy would repeat the words with careful pronunciation. And sometimes he would point to things and say the Crow word, as if teaching Sam in return. It was during one of these informal language lessons that Sam discovered something that stopped him cold. James had been playing with blocks Sam had carved from scraps of wood, building towers and knocking them down with delighted giggles. But when Sam wasn't looking, the boy had arranged the blocks in a pattern that took Sam's breath away. The blocks formed the shape of a cross, not a Christian cross, but the traditional crow symbol for the four directions, the sacred pattern that represented the balance of all life. It was far too complex for a child James's age to create by accident. "Where did you learn that?" Sam asked, kneeling beside. The boy. James looked up at him and smiled, then pointed toward the ceiling. When Sam followed his gaze, he saw nothing but wooden beams and shadows. But James seemed to be looking at something specific, something that brought him comfort and joy. That night, Sam sat down and wrote 2 letters. The first was to his lawyer in Cheyenne, instructing him to change his will to leave everything to James and to research what legal steps would be needed to formally adopt the boy. The second letter was harder, a note to the Indian agent at the Crow Reservation, asking about Blue Sky and any family she might have left behind. Sam sealed both letters and set them aside to mail when he next made it to town, if he could manage the trip at all. The tuberculosis was getting worse, and some days he barely had the strength to care for himself, let alone an active toddler. But as he watched James sleeping peacefully by the fire, Sam felt something he hadn't experienced in years: determination. This child had crawled through a blizzard to find him. Martha had trusted him enough to send her son to him. Blue Sky had died protecting the boy on his journey home. Sam Garrett might be dying, but he wasn't dead yet. And until his last breath, he would do everything in his power to make sure James had the family and future Martha had dreamed of for him. Outside, the Wyoming wind sang through the pine trees, carrying with it the scent of snow and the promise of spring still months away. But inside the cabin, a dying man and an orphan child were building something new together, a family born not of blood alone. By late summer, Sam could no longer deny what both he and James already knew. His time was running short. The tuberculosis was winning its slow war against his body, and even the purpose and joy that James had brought to his life couldn't hold back the inevitable much longer. But Sam was determined to use whatever time remained to prepare James for the future, and for the difficult truth about his heritage that the boy would need to understand as he grew older. It was during a warm August evening, as they sat by the creek behind the cabin watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and purple, that Sam decided it was time for the hardest conversation he'd ever had to have. "James," Sam said carefully, "there's something important I need to tell you about your mama, about Martha." James, now walking and talking with the confidence of a child who felt completely secure in his father's love, looked up from the stick boats he was floating in the creek. "I know about Mama," he said simply. "She told me." "What did she tell you?" "That she lived with the Crow people before she met you. That my first papa was a warrior named Little Wolf. That she had to leave me with Blue Sky to keep me safe." James paused, then added with startling maturity, "that she loved us both, but different." Sam felt his breath catch. James was not yet 3 years old, but he spoke with the understanding of someone much older. Whether this knowledge came from dreams, spiritual visitations, or some kind of genetic memory, the boy clearly understood the complex circumstances of his birth. "Are you sad about it?" Sam asked. James considered this seriously, as he considered everything sometimes. But Blue Sky said that love doesn't have borders, like rivers don't have walls. She said I got to be loved by 3 worlds, the Crow world, Mama's world, and your world. That makes me lucky. Blue Sky was a wise woman. She's still wise. She visits sometimes, like Mama does. Sam had learned to accept these statements without question. Whether James was experiencing actual spiritual contact or processing complex emotions through his imagination, the comfort and wisdom he derived from these visits was undeniable. As autumn approached, Sam began teaching James practical skills that went beyond basic ranch work. He showed the boy how to hunt and fish, how to preserve meat for winter, how to read the signs of changing weather and seasons. But more importantly, he taught James about character. Being a man isn't about being strong or tough, Sam explained one crisp October morning as they repaired fence together. It's about doing what's right, even when it's hard. It's about protecting people who can't protect themselves. It's about keeping your word, even when it costs you. James absorbed these lessons with the same intensity he brought to everything else. But he also taught Sam things in return, lessons about seeing beauty in small moments, about approaching the world with wonder instead of fear, about the healing power of unconditional love. Sam's health took a dramatic turn for the worse in November. A severe coughing fit left him weak and bedridden for several days, and Dr. Henderson's visit confirmed what they all knew was coming. Weeks, not months, the doctor said quietly after examining Sam. I'm sorry. I wish there was more I could do. That night, as Sam lay in bed struggling to breathe, James climbed up beside him and curled against his side. I'm scared, Papa, the boy whispered, the first time he'd admitted to any fear since arriving at the cabin. I know, Sam said, wrapping his arms around his son. It's okay to be scared. Being brave doesn't mean you're not afraid. It means you do what needs to be done, even when you are afraid. What needs to be done? Sam thought about this carefully. We need to make sure you'll be taken care of. And we need to say the things we want to say while we still can. Over the following days, Sam made arrangements he'd been putting off. He wrote to Martha's sister in Colorado, explaining about James and asking if she would be willing to take him in. He contacted the lawyer about ensuring the adoption papers would protect James's inheritance. Most importantly, he wrote a long letter to James himself, a letter the boy could read when he was older and needed guidance. Sam could no longer provide, but Sam's most important task was helping James understand what was coming and helping him prepare for life without the father who'd become the center of his world. You're going to have to live with other people for a while, Sam explained during one of their evening talks by the fire. Aunt Catherine in Colorado is a good woman. She'll take care of you until you're old enough to come back here and take care of the ranch yourself. Will she love me like you do? She'll love you, Sam assured him. Maybe different than I do, but she'll love you. And you'll always carry my love with you, no matter where you go. James was quiet for a long moment. Will you visit me like Mama does? I don't know, Sam said honestly, but I'll always be with you in here. He touched James's chest over his heart. Every lesson I taught you, every story I told you, every time I said I loved you, it's all in there forever. Catherine arrived in early December, having traveled from Colorado as soon as she received Sam's letter. She was a practical woman in her 40s, unmarried and dedicated to her work as a schoolteacher, but she took one look at James and fell completely under his spell. He's so much like Martha, she told Sam privately after spending an afternoon with the boy. The way he notices everything, the way he asks questions that make you think. But there's something else too, something special. He's got gifts, Sam agreed, both from his Crow heritage and from Martha. He'll need people who understand that, who won't try to make him be something he's not. I'll make sure he knows where he comes from, Catherine promised, both sides of his heritage. And I'll make sure he knows how much you loved him. Sam's final weeks were both peaceful and heartbreaking. James seemed to understand that their time together was ending, and he spent every possible moment close to his father's side. They read books together, Sam's voice growing weaker each day. They talked about the future, about the ranch James would inherit, about the man Sam hoped his son would become. On a cold December night, as snow began to fall outside the cabin windows, Sam felt his strength finally ebbing away. James was sleeping beside him, one small hand resting on Sam's chest, as if trying to keep his father's heart beating through sheer force of will. "Martha," Sam whispered to the quiet room, "I kept my promise. I loved him like my own. Take care of him now." In his fading vision, Sam thought he saw Martha standing at the foot of the bed, her face radiant with love and gratitude. Beside her stood a tall Native American man with kind eyes, Little Wolf, James's first father. And behind them, barely visible but unmistakably present, was Blue Sky, the woman who died bringing James home. They weren't here to take Sam away, he realized. They were here to watch over James, to make sure the boy would never truly be alone. Sam's last conscious act was to press his lips to James's forehead in a final kiss. "I love you, son," he whispered, "forever and always." James woke as the sun rose, somehow knowing immediately that his father was gone. But instead of the hysteria Catherine had feared, the boy simply climbed out of bed, walked to Martha's photograph on the mantelpiece, and spoke quietly in Crow, words that sounded like a prayer or blessing. When Catherine asked him later what he'd said, James replied simply, "I thank them for letting us love each other." The funeral was small but meaningful. The few neighbors who'd come to know and respect Sam attended, along with several Crow elders who'd somehow learned of James's story and wanted to honor both the man who'd raised their lost child and the woman who'd died protecting him. Catherine was amazed when one of the elders approached James after the service and spoke to him in Crow. The boy responded fluently, though he'd had no contact with his birth culture since Blue Sky's death. "Did he say?" Catherine asked. "He said, 'I am the bridge between worlds,'" James replied with the matter-of-fact acceptance that characterized everything about him, "and that both my fathers would be proud of the man I'm going to become." As they prepared to leave for Colorado, James insisted on visiting the graves behind the cabin one final time. He placed wildflowers on Martha's grave, on the baby's grave, on Blue Sky's grave, and finally on Sam's fresh mound of earth. "I'll be back," he promised the quiet cemetery. "When I'm grown up, I'll come back and take care of our ranch. And I'll teach my children about all of you, about how love doesn't end when people die." Catherine felt tears sting her eyes as she watched this remarkable child say goodbye to the only home he'd ever really known. But she also felt hope, because she could see that James wasn't just leaving. He was carrying everyone who'd loved him forward into the future. Years later, when James returned to Wyoming as a young man to claim his inheritance, he found the cabin exactly as Sam had left it. Martha's photograph still sat on the mantelpiece, and Sam's chair still waited by the fireplace. But the ranch itself had been cared for by neighbors who'd respected Sam's memory and honored his wish that the land be preserved for his son. James rebuilt the ranch into something greater than it had ever been, a place where people of all backgrounds were welcome, where children could learn about both their heritage and their potential. He married a teacher from back east who understood his unique position in the world, and together they raised children who carried forward the legacy of love that had saved a dying man and transformed an orphaned child. But every Christmas Eve, James would sit by the fire in Sam's old chair and tell his children the story of the night. A baby crawled through the snow, carrying a ring from the past and a promise for the future. He'd tell them about Sam Garrett, the man who'd been ready to die until love gave him a reason to live. And he'd remind them that families aren't just made by blood, they're made by choice, by sacrifice, and by the belief that every child deserves to be loved completely and unconditionally. The McCready Ranch, for James had taken Sam's name, as his own middle name, became famous throughout Wyoming Territory as a place where lost souls could find family, where different cultures could coexist in harmony, and where the impossible became possible through the power of love. And on quiet winter nights, when the snow fell thick and the wind sang through the mountains. Visitors to the ranch would swear they could see figures moving in the firelight of the old cabin, a man and woman with their arms around each other, watching over the children who'd inherited their legacy of love. The ring that had brought James home, Martha's wedding ring, was eventually passed down through generations of the family Sam and James had built together. And with it went the story of how love could transcend death, how families could be born from hope and sacrifice, and how sometimes the greatest miracles came disguised as the smallest gestures of faith. In the end, Samuel Garrett had gotten his wish. He'd lived long enough to love and be loved again. And in loving James, he'd created something that would outlast both of them, a family built not on blood alone, but on the unshakable foundation of unconditional love.